All right, guys. So we're going to start Exodus 1 today. And here we go. Let me just fix this real quick and then we're going to start. All right. So, Exodus 1 for chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. Now, these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man in his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were the seed of Jacob were 75 people, for Joseph was in Egypt already. Now Joseph died, as did all his brothers and the entire generation. Then the children of Israel increased and multiplied, became numerous, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. But a new king arose in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And so he said to his nation, "Look, the race of the children of Israel is a great multitude and is stronger than we. Come, let us outwit them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so escape out of the land." Therefore he set taskmasters over them to afflict them in their works, and they built for Pharaoh strong cities, Pithom and Ramses and On, which is Heliopolis. But the more they humbled them, the more they multiplied and grew, and the Egyptians greatly abhorred the children of Israel. So the Egyptians tyrannized the children of Israel by force. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All of their labor in which they made them serve was by violence. So Israel starts with 75 people in Egypt, and over many years, this people group has increased and grown very large in Egypt. Joseph and all his brothers have died, so we get a time lapse. And there came to power a Pharaoh who, quote, forgets Joseph. Minimally 300 to 400 years have passed since Joseph and his brothers now. So the language here in Exodus 1 saying Israel multiplied and grew uses similar language to Genesis 1 when it talks about God filling the land, air, and sea with life and says it teemed with life. It uses the same language, but with Israel. They're teaming. They're doing what they're supposed to do. But this new king, Pharaoh, does not like this. Joseph in Genesis was blessed because he saved Egypt from famine. That respect that the previous pharaohs once had and preserved for St. Joseph has now disappeared with the new pharaoh. He simply does not care and is hostile and sees them as Asiatic foreigners, whom he, the Egyptian, should be suspicious of and sees them as a threat. Remember, in the Hyksos era, Egypt had to fight a war internally to get the Egyptian empire back under Egyptian non Asiatic control. Israelites may be peaceful with Egypt now, but Egypt had fought a lot of wars. And with Asiatic groups like the Hittites, Canaanites, etc., from Pharaoh's perspective, these Israelites are peaceful with us, but they're also kin on the big scale with other Asiatic tribes and nations. So Pharaoh starts thinking, what if they fight us and Israel decides to join in and try to overthrow us? He doubts they'll be loyal to him in Egypt, so Pharaoh decides they need to control them. So Pharaoh takes these mostly agricultural folks and has them enslaved and makes them do work for Egypt. So the Israelites help build and strengthen Egypt's cities of Pithom, Ramses, and On, which is Heliopolis. That's the Greek name for On. Fun fact: Israel did not build the pyramids. They were already there for thousands of years. These cities are likely being renovated. Likely there are also former images of the previous pharaoh that are being erased and replaced with this pharaoh's image. One city named here is Ramses. Ramses means son of Ra, the sun god. Some scholars have tried to use this to make a date, but this is problematic as there were many Ramses who took that name, 11 to be exact. It's also highly likely that the editor Ezra is involved again here, as he was in Genesis, giving us a place name. Because of this possibility, we cannot exclude the idea that when these cities were being built by the Israelites, or rebuilt, their names were these names because it's very possible later Pharaoh renamed the cities, and by the time Ezra's writing, he has these as their current place names. So Pharaoh has enslaved them, had them work hard and long, thinking this would help keep the Israelites' population under control. Slave labor is being used to make it difficult to have babies and provide and care for them. Also, slave labor is brutal, and it can kill the worker slave, which is also a win for Pharaoh, as it might help him chop their numbers down and keep them from a revolt and planning one. And a fun fact: there's only been one successful noted slave revolt in history, and that is the Haitian Revolution in 1791 through 1804 AD. There won't be one for Israel. Even when in slave labor, though, Israel grows in numbers, and it makes Egypt even crueler and more violent to the Israelites. So, chapter 1, verses 15 through 22. Then the king of the Egyptians spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the names of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see that they're about to give birth, if it's a male, kill him. But if a female, let her live. But the midwives feared God and didn't do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children? Thus the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the women of Egypt, for they are lively and gave birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. So it was because the midwives feared God, he provided 2 households for them. Pharaoh commanded all his people next, saying, every male to the Hebrews you shall cast into the river, but every female you shall save alive. So that plan did not work, his original plan. So Pharaoh comes up with an even crueler and more evil plan. He calls and commands 2 Hebrew midwives, Puah and Shiphrah, to kill all the male children who are born. Verses 15 through 16, the text here says, see, they're about to give birth in Greek, but in Hebrew it says, when you see them on the potter's wheel, or see them on their birth stools. This doesn't make a lot of sense to translate either the Greek or the Hebrew that way into English. But here's why it is that way. So in Egyptian mythos, within their stories of the gods, humans were all created by the god Canaan. He's the one with a ram's head and a human body. He is depicted as making humans on a pottery wheel. So this reference is by way of Egyptian mythology about when the baby is developing in the womb. So what Pharaoh's saying is, when the midwife tries to determine the gender before the baby's born, if they can determine it's a boy, abort them. And if it's a girl, let them live. And to do an abortion, they would have to use herbs and mixtures to cause a miscarriage. And if only the girls survive, Egyptian men can marry them and marry multiple women, since Egyptians practice polygamy. And they can have children with them as Egyptians and eventually assimilate, and there will be no more Israelites. That's his plan. So the Hebrew midwives in verse 17 didn't do any of this. They lie and deceive Pharaoh. They lie and say the Israelites are hardly women. God blesses these 2 midwives for their lie. Lying, as we learned in Genesis, is not always sinful. Deception, if used to bring about something good and just, is fine to do in the Old Testament. They are trying to do an injustice to God as well as his people and their children. So these women are doing a good thing. So that's why God blesses these Israelites for their faithfulness over and over again. And Pharaoh fights God and tries to bring death. The Pharaoh has set himself up as an enemy of Israel, but also as an enemy of God. Moses is not even born yet, and he's already this depraved and willing to commit serious sinful acts against these people. Pharaoh next calls on all Egyptians to kill and murder Israelite males by drowning them in the Nile River. I'm not an expert on Egyptian life and religion, but with the research I found, even for Egyptian standards, what the Pharaoh is doing and ordering the people to do is evil and immoral and very depraved, as he's desecrating the Nile River, a symbol of life and fertility, by murdering infants in it. Pharaoh's desecration of the Nile is a violation of Egyptian sacred order. So in the Exodus narrative, Pharaoh's command to drown Hebrew infants, boys, in the Nile River is a horrifying act of brutality. From the perspective of the biblical text, it's clearly an act of rebellion and hostility against Yahweh. However, even under an Egyptian worldview, this would be seen as very negative also. In ancient Egypt, they believed that the Nile was not just a river, but a god as well, often personified as Hapi, which he or she brought life and fertility. He was also considered to be a father who helped maintain the balance of the cosmos, regarded as an orderly, harmonious system, a friend of Geb, the god of land, and the lord of Neper, god of grain. These deities and the crocodile god Sobek also ruled the river's powers and waters. They were often invoked for protecting others from the dangers that the Nile could present at times. So the Nile's rise and flows were celebrated with hymns, offerings, and festivals. Temple inscriptions such as the famous hymn to the Nile praise the river as a divine that, quote, brings forth herbage for the flocks, end quote, and provides abundance for gods and people alike. Offerings to the Nile and its associated deities were carefully regulated. Only ritually pure substances were to be used: bread, beer, grain, oxen, birds, gazelles, incense, and even sacred crocodiles. Human sacrifice and bloodshed, particularly in the river, had no place there. In fact, there are stories like those in the Papyrus Anastasi and more that clarify that Egypt celebrated the Nile's purity, not the defilement of it. So This goes into the order of Maat and the chaos of Isfet. So central to the Egyptians was the concept of Ma'at, the divine order, justice, and balance that governed the cosmos. To uphold Ma'at, Egypt followed numerous laws. The Book of the Dead includes negative confessions, where the deceased swears, I have not polluted the water, I have not directed the running water, and I have not slain either man or woman. So the purity of the Nile was considered a matter of cosmic balance. Polluting it was tantamount to violating the sacred structure of reality. While certain myths and rituals happened that involved destruction, these were symbolic curse rituals, not actual human sacrifices. Even there are legendary texts like the Westgard Papyrus that share that though a criminal's execution was an exception, it was still controversial, and such killings were forbidden in sacred spaces like the river. So Pharaoh's order to drown Israelite babies in the Nile wouldn't just be an act of cruelty. It would be an act of cosmic offense, even by Egyptian standards. As Egypt's high priest king, his order to use the Nile as sacred god as a means of mass murder would have defiled the Nile, disrupted Maat, and dishonored the gods. As Pharaoh, he is supposed to and is appointed to achieve Maat and destroy Isfet, which is chaos. So this is great irony here in Exodus, as Pharaoh, not only due to his hatred of Yahweh and Israel, resists the God of Israel, but also betrays Egypt and its sacred orders. In contrast to the earlier Pharaoh of Joseph's time, who, despite suspicion of Asiatics, worked to save Egypt, this Pharaoh, though, is so depraved and hardened in his opposition to Israel that he willingly and knowingly desecrates his own land and the gods of Egypt in that process. So Pharaoh becomes an agent of Isfet, which is chaos, instead, who is personified in the form of Apep, aka Apophis, opposing both the divine order of Yahweh and the sacred harmony of Egypt. Pharaoh very much is not doing his role right at all. He is to serve Maat order, but he serves Isfet chaos instead. So Pharaoh basically becomes more of an anti-Pharaoh for Egypt, one who serves the great enemy of the Egyptian gods, Apep or Apophis, the chaos serpent who seeks to devour the sun god Ra and overthrow him and unravel creation itself. So it sounds like he serves Satan, and from a Christian perspective, he does. So this is not just bad governing choices, but a cosmic betrayal. And we're going to cover this a lot later, but this adds to why Pharaoh also brings judgment upon Egypt instead of protecting and saving it. So ultimately, Pharaoh will not just lose to Yahweh. He's going to undo himself in the process by polluting the waters, shattering order, serving Apophis chaos. Ironically, he'll end up drowning in the Red Sea, which to Egypt was considered to be like the anti-Nile River, as it was seen as a part of the chaotic edge of the world, governed by Nun, primordial chaos, and Apep, Apophis. So there's a great irony there that Pharaoh served Apophis over Maat and dies where Apophis would reign. So the Red Sea also symbolized death to Israel, and Yahweh fittingly uses this location to display his power over chaos and death by parting the sea and triumphing where no Egyptian deity ever held sway. The biblical text, even in Exodus 1, implies Pharaoh's evil is not just rebellion against Yahweh and Israel. It's self-destructive, sacrilegious, and also from the Egyptians' point of view. Drowning anyone, especially infants, would have horrified Egyptian priests and Egypt as a whole, and violated long-standing taboos, and polluted one of Egypt's most sacred and revered sources of divine life. So Pharaoh's actions represent a total rejection of both Yahweh and Egypt's divine orders, making Pharaoh a figure of ultimate defilement and disorder, an agent possessed by Satan to the Israelites and Apophis to the Egyptians, a true tyrant and a true Nephilim. So that's the end of that one, and we will do chapter 2 on the next one. And so I hope you guys enjoyed that. And if you liked that one, hit like and subscribe. And I will see y'all next time on the next podcast. Thank you. God bless.